So I mentioned briefly that it was back in 1997, I'm quite sure, when my mentor, my primary mentor in physics, Arthur Science, organized a Mind and Life meeting in Dharamsala, one of our 5-day extravaganzas. And it was on physics and Buddhism, and he invited to this meeting just remarkable, delightful group of open-minded physicists. And clearly the most renowned one, and quite very impressive one, was Anton Zeilinger, I mentioned before. But there are others. I met him for the first time on that occasion, and then a number of occasions later. But others as well who really brought openness, and it was a real dialogue. They weren't there just to lecture the Dalai Lama about the latest, cutting-edge research in quantum mechanics, but actually or cosmology and so on, but they were really there to listen. It was delightful. Tremendous privilege to be there with Thupten Jinpa in the role of co-interpreter. It was like just a feast. It was such a delight to see the open mind on both sides engaging with each other. That was 1997, and I've told this anecdote many times, it'll be very short, but when Anton Zeilinger was describing quantum mechanics and the implications of quantum mechanics, and commenting, and I paraphrase here, that when you try to find an elementary particle like an electron and really identify it, what its characteristics are from its own side, by its own inherent nature, you don't find it. Well, His Holiness, who's a master of Madhyamaka, he listened to this, and of course the whole talk, he had 2.5 hours to present. It was marvelous. And His Holiness commented, it's remarkable you've had such insight into the nature of emptiness without knowing Madhyamaka. And then Anton Seilinger's response was, what's Madhyamaka? He'd come to this conference simply because he was curious. He had an open mind and thought, perhaps, who knows, maybe these Tibetans have something interesting to say. The Dalai Lama, a great representative, not just of an individual, but of a whole culture. Not only Tibetan culture, but the whole history of Buddhism, going back to Buddha himself. He's a representative of that, right? And so Anton Zeilinger asked, well, what's Madhyamaka? Then His Holiness gave a brilliant synopsis of that, of the Madhyamaka view. And then, and Anton, I can't quote this verbatim, but my recollection is, he said, it's amazing how you could have insights like that without knowing quantum mechanics. But what was really cool was what followed from that. There was a real meeting of minds here. And Thupten Jinpa and I were kind of the glue fitting the two together, just as the language liaisons. But then it got really much more thrilling. And that is, then Anton, who back then was still at the University of Innsbruck, where he had done his groundbreaking work in quantum teleportation. He said, Your Holiness, I'd love to invite you to my lab so I can show you what the experiments are that we have used to come to these conclusions based on empirical evidence. Would you like to come to my lab? And I can show you around, we can discuss the empirical evidence and the research giving rise to that evidence. His Holiness turned to his assistant, it was Tenzin Gyatso back then, and basically, remember Star Trek and Jean-Luc Picard? He said, number one, make it so. Not quite in so many words, but that was it. Make it so. That is, it's happening. It was the next year that was set up. So His Holiness, and then Arthur Science, of course, was there. Thupten Jinpa and I, as the two interpreters, came there. And this was just fairy tale. To be walking through Anton's cutting-edge, state-of-the-art quantum physics laboratory with His Holiness, and he's showing them experiment by experiment by experiment how they had come to those conclusions. It was sure delightful. Then His Holiness needed to zip off to Finland right afterwards. It was only, I think, there for 2 days. But Thupten Jinpa and I weren't in any hurry. Thupten Jinpa stayed behind, so His Holiness went to Finland today. Somehow Thupten Jinpa didn't need to go immediately. So Thupten Jinpa and I and Arthur Science and Anton Zeilinger had a day off. And the four of us hiked up into the Tyrolean Alps and we talked physics, philosophy, and Madhyamaka all day. And came back with incredible sunburn. But it was really one of the most magnificent days of my life to be part of that. It was fantastic. The point here, number one, I just like telling stories. But number two is, what was so cool about this is that Anton didn't simply have some very cool ideas. He could take us to his lab, and His Holiness, being a great empiricist himself, immediately leapt at the opportunity and took place just 1 year later. What I would love to see is if His Holiness could say, Anton, would you like to come to our lab? And I'll show you the yogis who've achieved Shamatha, the first jhana, second jhana, who are working with the kasinas and the nimittas. And would you like to see why we believe what we believe? What's our empirical evidence? What's our research? What are our methodologies by which we've come to these conclusions, which are not just religious beliefs or philosophical speculations, but are theories based on empirical evidence? I would love for that to have been the case. So once again, I always sound the same drum. Need to come back to experience. But now here we are, we're practicing now this taking the mind as a path, which is both a shamatha method, which it clearly is, but by the by, as we are attending very closely to the mind, we're bound to, even without introducing the word Vipashyana, even without introducing any sophisticated modes of investigation or analysis, by carefully observing anything for a while, you're bound to get some insights, just because you're looking very carefully, discerningly, mindfully. And so then one could ask, well, then, if such methods exist, then why isn't introspection? I mean, the people in psychology, neuroscience, they're very intelligent. They're way above average intelligence. They're highly educated. They're sophisticated. And they want to know the truth. I think those are all very fair statements and good generalizations. So over the last 100 years, that's an awful lot of time. They say that in the 20th century we learn scientifically more about the universe than all the preceding centuries combined. Probably true. So without elaborating on that point, with all that intelligence, why have we overlooked introspection? The most obvious thing to do if you want to understand the nature of the minds, different mental states, maybe different dimensions of consciousness, why has it been overlooked? Why? There's not a simple answer. But again, I want to emphasize, and with great respect, these people are very intelligent. I know a lot of them. Academic psychologists, I've been criticizing their views a lot. But it's not because they're unintelligent. But neither were highly educated European, Eurocentric men 100 years ago. They weren't unintelligent either. Highly educated, very intelligent, and completely ignoring, and I mean almost completely ignoring, potential contribution of half the human race to expanding understanding of the nature of reality for run-cup corporations, businesses, law, medicine, and so forth. That's quite astonishing. Half? I mean, that's idiotic. That's just like, cutting Italy in half and say, southern part of Italy doesn't count. Shut up, have kids, raise the farm. We in northern Italy will run the show. I'm sensing there may be some of that sentiment. Let alone Northern Europe and Southern Europe. Let alone West and East. What on earth could the Chinese, the Thais, the Indians, what on earth could they know about reality that they haven't learned from us? I mean, really, how could they know anything for the last 5,000 years? The cognitive deficit is absolutely staggering, and it's still here. We love to laugh at the people 100 years ago. They're going to be getting a belly laugh out of us if we survive. So, why haven't introspective modes of observation been introduced, incorporated, enthusiastically integrated into scientific methodologies, which, after all, was proposed 125 years ago by William James, Harvard professor, great distinction, great renown on both sides of the Atlantic. And he said, we should draw on neuroscientific inquiry to look at the neural correlates. We should draw on behavior for the behavioral expressions. First, foremost, and always, we should rely upon introspection to understand the nature of mind, understand the nature of subjective experience. He said it so clearly, and he's been so resoundingly ignored ever since the rise of behaviorism 105 years ago. Here are some of the objections, and these are not trivial. But these are the reasons I'm suggesting here, apart from metaphysical reasons, personal prejudice, money, politics, power, prestige, all those non-subjective elements, which are enormously influential, but purely scientific reservations about including introspection within the repertoire of methodologies of the scientific study of the mind. Again, these are not unintelligent people, so the reasons are not silly. Here's the first one that I've come up with. It's a short list. Introspection, why not include them? Because introspective observations are unstable and impossible to verify. I think you've all experienced unstable observations, right? Who hasn't? You get an insight, you have some breakthrough, some big experience, and then, oh, it's gone. And I wanted it back, and I tried, and I couldn't find it. Unstable, yeah, they are. Impossible to verify? Sure. What kind of fruit am I thinking of? Or I'm thinking of a fruit at all? Is it a watermelon or Marilyn Monroe? How do you know? I can tell you, but then maybe I'm lying, maybe I'm delusional. You don't know. But I've addressed that one already. That you don't know any more than I understand Sir Andrew Weil's solution to Fermat's last theorem with his 150 pages of logic. I look at that. I couldn't even read the first line, let alone critique and find the mistake in the earlier version halfway through or whenever it was. But if I were sufficiently trained, and if I'm sufficiently intelligent, then I could, but not without training. Similarly, as I've noted again and again, and it's an empirical fact, highly trained Hindu yogis, they recognize each other. Highly trained Buddhist yogis, the great Zen masters recognize other great Zen masters. Great Tibetan masters recognize other Zen masters, and so forth. And they may critique. Total brilliance, but here's a point that I find effective. And yet it's all internal. But it's intersubjective, and they're dealing out of a common pool of very high-level, sophisticated training. Okay? So unstable, well, that's why we develop shamatha. So there's an addressable problem. They are unstable, but not intrinsically. But if you have no methods of training attention skills at all, that's modern science, then that looks like an insoluble problem. If you have no pool of highly trained contemplatives with their intersubjective language and peer review, which Tibetans do have still, and they certainly had in Tibet, if you have none of that, then they're impossible to verify. It's just he said, she said. So one more yogi says, I'm enlightened, and if he or she is really charismatic, gives off a really good vibe, really articulate, gets a whole lot of followers, they're regarded as an authority. Imagine if science worked that way. No peer review. Just, if you're a good bullshitter, then you get a lot of reputation regarded as authority, and then suddenly everybody's quoting you. This is pathetic. But it's because we are so primitive contemplatively. So there's the first one. Well, addressable problems, unstable and impossible to verify. Yeah, if you're living in a contemplative or primitive society, and if you have no means for developing shamatha, that's true. But not otherwise. These are addressable. Here, second one. Introspective observations are useful only for understanding meditative states, but not ordinary and pathological mental states. That is, this is a qualm raised by people who have clearly never meditated in their lives. They think if you meditate, do it for a long time, like 10 minutes, that you'll enter in something called a meditative state. But when you meditate, you just get a meditative state, right? 'Cause that's what meditation is for, to enter a meditative state. But then if you're in a meditative state, then you won't know about ordinary states. I guess you become amnesiac or something. And then you won't know about pathological states unless you're a crazy meditator. This one is just completely naive. But it's also very, very common, and that is in the popular press nowadays. And I've seen it in scientific literature, I'm very sad to say. It's very, very widespread that scientists study meditation and meditative state, and there's one of them. And they're basically, if you read the popular literature right now, promoted by over-enthusiastic, zealotous propagandists for the mindfulness movement. They'll tell you that mindfulness, as in moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness, that's the essence of all meditation. So you don't really need to look elsewhere. We've already grabbed it by the balls, and this is it. This is the horrendously ridiculous, but quite obnoxious propaganda coming out of that we've already captured it. This is all there is to it, and it's really good for stress reduction and productivity in the marketplace, and it has health benefits. But that's pretty much it. We just wrapped up what Chinese, Indian, Buddhist, and so forth civilizations came up with 5,000 years. They're really good at reducing stress. They're really good. The ethnocentric bigotry of this staggers the imagination. And it's in the popular press. There is something called a meditative state. That's like a primitive person coming from, let's say, Tibet, hearing about science, and saying, I've heard you got something called the scientific method. What is it? and thinking it's one thing, whether you're a cosmologist or an ornithologist, or you're studying viruses, it basically, just tell me, what's that scientific method? Tell me, what was that again? What's the scientific method? That one thing. You say, would you please go away and get educated? Same. So this one's not even worthy of consideration. It's just too ignorant. The third one is interesting one, and that is your introspective observations are suspect, unreliable, cannot be counted on because they are subject to contamination by theory. One could spend the next 5 weeks on that one because it's legitimate. This is why, according to the history books, and I have a very good article, by the way, by Kurt Danziger on the rise and fall of introspection, and he showed the complex reasons why introspection was discarded. I can put that on the website if you like. It's very good. And it shows it was much more complicated than the propaganda suggests, that it didn't work. And then we moved on. And that's the popular view, the propaganda view. They won. They had the microphone. It just didn't work. Well, but it didn't work for various reasons, and one that is commonly cited is that when they were doing these introspective research with not the scientists, but their subjects doing the introspection 125 years ago, that, as I said before, the scientists would lead the witness to get and tell them what they thought they would probably see, and then lo and behold, their observations were contaminated by the hypotheses, the pet theories, the beliefs, expectations of the scientists, because the subject wanted to please them. And so one laboratory proved this, another one proved the contrary, because the people running the labs had different beliefs. So it was pseudoscience, and they tried that for 35 years, and then discarded it. So that's a legitimate concern. This is not trivial. This is an important one. So we have Christian contemplatives, for example, who are, many of them, very, very well-versed, very knowledgeable in Christian theology, like Thomas Aquinas, for example, who after years and years and years of study and writing and theologizing, then entered into contemplative. He had a contemplative breakthrough. But of course, whether it's he or Meister Eckhart or Nicholas of Cusa or Jakob Böhme, whoever it is, when they come out of their meditative states, which often are referred to as being ineffable, inconceivable, ineffable, but they talk about it, which is reasonable. Buddhists do that. Everybody does that. Of course, they're going to explain the nature of their ineffable or transcendent experience in terms of the conceptual framework that they've embraced before they started. And that's true for everybody. Of course, whether you're Tibetan Buddhist, Zen Buddhist, Hindu, Taoist, whatever, you talk about it, it's going to be in terms of the Tao, it's going to be Atman and Brahman, in terms of primordial consciousness, in terms of Nibbana, and so forth. Right? So that's an issue. That's a significant one. You make observations. But we had Hilary Putnam. Now, what did he say? That language is so embedded in reality, to try to describe a reality independent of language is hopeless endeavor. So then how? This is an interesting one. How do you enter into meditative states that transcend language, that are probing into a dimension of reality that is language independent, not contingent upon conceptual designation? How do you do that? How do you not have your introspection, your Christian contemplative practice going right down into the depths of the deepest insights of Christian contemplatives and so forth? How do you not drag with you your conceptual framework, your language, and so forth? How do you ever transcend it? And when you come out and articulate it, how do you do it in a dogma-neutral language? How do you do that? That's an interesting one. So but let's not consider it intractable, because after all, we step back and we say, okay, but now Buddhist contemplative practice, is it working? Is it helping? Are the people gaining deep realization? Yeah, they are. So there's an empirical fact. Chaja Rinpoche and Tupan Rinpoche and one after another. These are great yogis and Yangtan Rinpoche. So we don't have to wonder, are they doing okay or are they basically screwed up? Anybody who watches with an open mind, they're not screwed up at all. So something's working. How is it working? How do they transcend the contamination by theory? And the greatest contemplatives in the Christian tradition, the Advaita tradition, and so forth, they have done it, but how do they do it? So I think we're here in kindergarten here, taking the mind as the path. So what we're seeking to do is this, right? I'm holding up my index finger again, the stillness, and that is, as much as you can, be quiet. Rest in the silent room of awareness. Don't talk. Don't project. Don't judge. Don't evaluate. Don't censor. Don't edit. Don't react. Don't like. Don't dislike. Just try to get a clear signal to noise ratio and see what reality is telling you, rather than immediately, obsessively and compulsively fusing it with your expectations, beliefs, thoughts, and so forth. Try to get a clear signal. We've been doing that from day one. And we can make progress. That's good. That you don't try it for 6 months or even for two months and say, I'm no better now than I was on the first day. I could completely, there was no progress whatsoever. I've never actually heard anybody say that. After an 8-week retreat, nothing happened. I'm in the same bog, the same rut as I was when it began. I've never heard that happen. So are there grounds for improvement? Can we contaminate less? If we so, then let's do it less. And let's do it less and less and less. And you go into Mahamudra and Dzogchen, and it's really less. That's an interesting one. And then we have subject to phenomenological illusion. Phenomenological illusion, just by the way, that your observations are subject to contamination by theory, that's very true actually. William James recognized this, that introspection is fallible. It's prone to error. You can make observations that are false. But through trial and error, and multiple people being trained in introspection, slowly over time, through trial and error and looking back and identifying prior errors, you can come, in principle, to a consensus of highly trained introspectionists without theory contamination, making valid, replicable, intersubjective discoveries. It can be done. It's an addressable problem. But William James pointed out, this is enormously important, that yes, introspection is fallible. And that's true for every other kind of observation that we ever make. They're all fallible. They're all fallible. Cosmology, elementary particle physics, biology, and so forth. Observations are fallible for a myriad of reasons. There's that issue, but also enormously important, and when we come back to this, we're going to have a ball this afternoon, that even if you're a scientist, your observations are contaminated by theory. And anybody who says otherwise is mistaken. Sometimes I like to use a little word. I could use so many words at that point. I'll just say, mistaken. Observations. The word theory from the Greek means to observe. It means to behold. Einstein said it is, I'm paraphrasing here, it's common to believe, what did he say? It was about belief and observation. He said, contrary to copy belief, it's your beliefs that enable you to make observations. That was the end. But while the contrary belief is common, that you make your observations and belief comes afterward, he said, in reality, it's your belief that enables you to make observations. I can give it an exact quote if you like, but that was the gist of it. So yeah, this is a legitimate concern, and it's a concern for all of science. And it's a concern for anybody interested in reality who's basing their beliefs on observations. The next one is subject to phenomenological illusion. And that is, what that means is that the way things appear is not how they exist. Gee, that's right. That sounds familiar. That's true for every branch of science. You look out at the stars. Well, there's no star there. Where you're looking at it right now, there's no star there. It's moved on. Because it took that light hundreds of years, thousands of years, millions of years to get to your eyeball. And you're looking at it right there. There's no star there. Maybe it's burnt out. You don't know. You won't know until the light gets to you, and maybe it takes, 5,000 years, in which case you'll never know. All appearances, we've known this since the time of Copernicus, and long before then, it seemed like the sun is rising and while the earth is stable. It's all over the place. It's all over the way, from elementary particles to cosmology. Appearances are contrary or different with, often incompatible with, the reality. Now we come to observing mental images, mental appearances, thoughts, and so forth. They are what they are. They're not representations of something else. They are just like I'm looking at the blue sky. I'm not saying that there's something objectively out there that is blue. I'm just saying when I look at the sky, I see blue. The blue appearance is not an optical illusion. It's not misleading. It's not a phenomenological, what did he call it? A phenomenological illusion. It's, when I look at the sky, it's blue. That's not an illusion. That's true. When I observe appearances rising in my mind, they're not phenomenological illusions. They are what they are. They are what they are. It's an image of a watermelon. That's what it is. That's not an illusion. It's not a watermelon, but I didn't think there was a watermelon inside my head. Otherwise, I'd sell them. I can come up with watermelons faster than you can grow them. If they were real, I'd just start selling them. I'd be a watermelon seller. I could make my living that way. But why not diamonds? I just imagine diamonds, whatever. So that one's kind of lame. This is much more true of making observations of the outside world. Galileo, as he gazed through his telescope, was looking at images created and dependent upon his visual cortex that appeared to be out there, but they weren't. That's an optical illusion. That's a phenomenological illusion. And it was those observations that provide the starting point for all of modern science. All of modern science is based on observations of phenomenological illusions, and it's done pretty well. Observing mental phenomena, these are not phenomenological illusions. This is by a materialist that said, if you're seeing anything that's not physical, you must be delusional. This is just sheer dogma. This is absurd. Because they don't want to, they will gag on their vomit before they will acknowledge that actually there are non-physical phenomena that can be observed. They just don't want to admit that. So if you're observing thoughts and they're non-physical, then you're having a delusional fit because it doesn't correspond with their beliefs. Like my philosophy of mind professor that said mental images don't exist because they're not physical. I don't know how to do that except walk away and have a nice day. The next one is also interesting, and this is from Freud or the Freudian movement. Very interesting, sound. These observations we're making introspectively are unreliable and so forth because they are subject to concealment and misrepresentation by unconscious mental processes and motivations. The subconscious gets in there and it edits, it suppresses, it represses, it distorts, it warps according to motives, desires, inhibitions and so forth we may not even be aware of. So what finally comes to the surface of the conscious mind is not just what was there, but what got through the editors and the censorship and the distortions and bias and so forth. So in the case of my philosophy of mind professor, I guess he just doesn't see any mental images because they shouldn't be there. And John Searle, he's a very intelligent man. When I debated with him, I found it was not a productive conversation, but certainly he's not unintelligent. Very intelligent. But he says introspection doesn't exist. And why? Because he's a materialist. Mental images, what do? You shouldn't be able to observe them, because otherwise you'd have to start taking introspective observation seriously. He doesn't want to do that. And so, any kind of allegiance to dogma is bound to screen out, let alone subconscious ones. Conscious ones. We can exaggerate the nature of our experiences by thinking, oh, I just had nirvana, I just realized Rigpa. I heard one fellow say, I'm a Sambhogakaya. I've achieved Sambhogakaya. I'm not very compassionate, though. We had a problem. Ask Geshe-Rabten, what did I do? I'm Sambhogakaya, but I'm not very compassionate. So he's seeing things that are not there because he wanted them to be there. Other people don't see things there because they don't believe they can be, or they don't want them to be. This is on the conscious level, let alone subconscious drives, way beyond ideology and indoctrination. So that's a real issue. This is an interesting one, serious one. And so what to do with that? I think probably the best method would be just try to be as still as possible, and whatever comes up, just let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be. There's a solution. It's not going to be overnight. It's not going to be, I used to be a sinner and now I'm free. I used to edit and so forth because of my subconscious drives and now I don't. It's not going to be like, I just decided to stop doing it. But as one becomes more and more adept in this practice, you can make more and more observations. When you feel a core sense of ease, if it feels core sense of ease, a sense of refuge, a sense of ease, a sense of fearlessness, then even if some horrendously awful thought comes up, don't even give an example, but just the most wretched, disgusting thought or emotion or desire comes up, you're not it. You didn't create it, and you're not responsible for it, and you don't own it. It just came up in your neighborhood. You know, it's like being in a room with a lot of people and suddenly you smell this incredibly terrible fart. You have to smell it, but you didn't do it. And if you did, you won't admit it. So we just let the mind fart away, you know. And whether it really stinks or just smells like, you know, the most expensive cologne or perfume, it's not yours. It's just what's coming up in the air. And if you're not cognitively fusing with it, it comes and it goes. And this is this fart wind, you know, you remain like an unflickering candle flame. Unmoved, uncontaminated, not cognitive and not blown out. So this is tough, but this practice precisely is designed to address that. You look at the shadow, you look at the demons. You, like Bhikkhuni Vajira, the Maras come up, you don't run away from them, you face them square on. And in her case, she was doing more than just settling the mind in its natural state. The Mara came up with a question. It wasn't a bad question. The motivation was completely unnerve her, you know, disable her. But she had guts. And she rose right back and defeated him. And he went away dejected and discouraged. Right? So that's Vipashyana. But we're preparing for that in settling the mind. That sense of ease, a sense of looseness, a sense of calm, a sense of fearlessness. Gajra Rinpoche told me years ago, about 20 years ago, when I went into a 6-month, quite intensive retreat in this practice, said, even if 1,000 Maras assault you, they'll not be able to hurt you. And even if 1,000 Buddhas come to bless you, they won't be able to help you. He's talking about mental appearances. I don't need any blessing. Some mental appearance in my mind. Whether it looks like the Dalai Lama or Dujum Lingpo or whoever it is, a mental appearance doesn't give any blessing. It's just cartoon. And whether it's a cartoon of a demon or a cartoon of, you know, a sacred being, they're just empty appearances. Empty appearances can't harm and they can't help any more than the appearances in a lucid dream. If you're seeing the appearances as appearances, you can relax. And you can take the knife and plunge it right into your guts and you can still relax. Right? So that's a good one. And the final one is, I'm sure there are more, but this is my short list. They are not reliable because introspective observations are subject to distortion due to the observer participancy. And that is the fact that what we're observing does not exist independently of our observations of it. When Galileo was discovering the moons around Jupiter, I think it's safe to say that he did not influence their orbit or influence whether they existed. And after he observed them, I think they went on their merry way, unperturbed, uninfluenced by his observation. That really set the gold standard for objectivity of observation, that you're observing something and your observation of it just doesn't have any impact on what you're observing at all. That was the gold standard. He started it. When he ruled balls down a ramp to see whether they accelerate or go at constant velocity. Well, it was just, he just watched. When he put the big ball and little ball off dropped them off the Tower of Pisa, he just watched. And then he saw what occurred whether or not he was watching. There were truths there that were not contingent upon his seeing them. Right? So, on the one hand. On the other hand, as we move 400 years forward to the rise of quantum mechanics, it's widely known, not disputed, every observation you make in quantum mechanics influences that which you're observing. And quantum mechanics is the most successful branch of physics in the history of science. Incredibly successful. But observer participatory is just one of those facts you deal with. So if it's okay for quantum mechanics, it should be okay for introspective, contemplative psychology. Let's practice.